All right, thanks for that forbearance. Welcome to today's Food for Thought. My name is Scotty Kirkland, and I serve as the Exhibits, Publications, and Programs Coordinator here at the Department of Archives and History. We're glad to have you back for the July edition of this long-running series. Before we get started, just a few brief announcements for you. If one visit to the archives today just isn't enough, I invite you to come back tonight at 6 o'clock right in this room for Alabama in the Movies. This summertime series features films with Alabama connections. When it comes to movies that have been produced in the last 25 years, it's difficult to find one with more Alabama connections than tonight's installment, Big Fish. Based on the novel by Birmingham native Daniel Wallace, the movie is filmed largely at Alabama locations, including the set-built town of Spector, which is located just a few miles from here. And a lot of our fellow Alabamians were extras in that movie, including probably some who are in this room or some who will be here tonight. The film starts at 6 o'clock. Concessions will be available for purchase. Alabama in the Movie series concludes next week, Thursday, July 25th, with My Cousin Vinny. That's two Utes, right? So on Saturday, July 27th, the Archives is going to host a workshop entitled African American Genealogy, Finding Your Story. The workshop will equip participants to efficiently navigate potential research roadblocks and address challenges specific to African American genealogical research. Following the workshop, the participants will have the opportunity to ask questions and share personal experiences in a discussion with the instructors and the other participants. The workshop is suited for all levels of research experience. Registration is required. A lunch is provided. The cost to attend is $30 for the public, $20 for students or friends of the Alabama Archives members. You can find more information, including the registration link, on our website. Our Alabama in the Movie series and our genealogical workshops are both sponsored by the Friends of the Alabama Archives. Finally, our Food for Thought series will continue on Thursday, August 15th with Dr. William Island, a native of Perry County and the former director of the Georgia Museum of Art at the University of Georgia. His topic will be Portraits of Early Alabama. That program, as always, will be at noon right here in the Farley Auditorium and streaming online. Food for Thought is sponsored by the Alabama Humanities Alliance and the Friends of the Alabama Archives. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Christy Anderson. She's a native of Indiana and holds a Bachelor's of Arts in Anthropology from the College of Worcester and a Master's of Arts in Public History with concentrations in Historic Preservation from the University of South Carolina. She moved to Montgomery to join the Alabama Historical Commission as the state coordinator for the National Register of Historic Places. After 5 years with the commission, Anderson joined the city of Montgomery as a long-range planner for downtown revitalization projects, eventually assuming the role of historic preservation coordinator for the city. She has since returned to the Alabama Historical Commission about 2 years ago to reprise her role as the National Register coordinator and as manager of the commission's easement program. Her topic today is documenting the architecture of the everyday in Alabama. Christy?
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Is this on? There we go. Okay, now I'm on. My name is Christy Anderson, and I am with the Alabama Historical Commission. Today, I'm going to illustrate how we are documenting overlooked and commonplace resources. One of the challenges we often encounter is that sometimes it's difficult to see what the things that are familiar to us in our environment as something special or significant. They just become part of the background, kind of the noise of what you see every day. And when those things disappear, sometimes it also doesn't take very long for you to forget what used to be in a particular spot. Okay, now I've mastered the clicker now too. Historic preservation is about merging history, which names, dates, places, facts, events, people, with tangible places. These are building sites, structures, objects, and districts. These are the things that we collectively refer to as resources. And we have to have both. We have to have a place to preserve, and that place needs to have some meaning. Not necessarily world-changing meaning, but it has to be significant to whatever context that resource exists in. So stories and memories are given a physical anchor in places. This is my elementary school. It no longer gives me that tangible connection for those memories I have. I have no reason to go back here. There's nothing, everything that I remember from that time in my life is now completely up here. Oh, I hit the wrong button. They told me I was going to do that. Okay. In the world of historic preservation, we talk about places of significance. Why is a place important? Is it for architecture? Is it a good example of a style or demonstrate a particular building technique? Does it convey a particular look in a community? Is it significant for history or patterns of history? In the early years of preservation, it was easy to pick out the important buildings worthy of preservation. They tended to be large, architecturally elaborate, and often the homes of prominent, mostly white male individuals in a community. That was the low-hanging fruit approach to preservation. Other worthy, I keep using these in quotes, worthy places of preservation were locations of significant events. The types your high school history teacher, my high school history teacher made us memorize, which is why I hated history in high school. In Montgomery, people often talk about Civil War. We've got Civil War, we've got civil rights. And, I often say there was 100 years of living in between those two events. That's a lot of time and a lot of things happen. So those are kinds of the kinds of things we're looking for here. Preservation today has evolved beyond that, often focusing on a resource's role within its community. It doesn't have to be the first, the last, or the only anything. It just needs to have meaning within its own context. And sometimes that means we have to dig a little deeper to figure out what that significance is, to make that meaningful connection. Whether that's a farmstead, a small agricultural town that relies on peanut production, or a village of modest houses that was built to support workers in a textile mill or a shipyard. For every large, architecturally significant building, there are any number of towns and communities where the resources collectively tell the history of that community. And those are important stories to tell. So where do we start? We start with documentation, and that involves getting out into the field with maps and cameras and survey forms. And if you're lucky, you have people who also drag out their grill and cook you burgers and hot dogs for lunch when you're finished. So I just want to start by giving a short overview of what forms the foundation of this work. Architectural surveys are systematic documentations of the built environment. We need to know what is physically present so we can better understand both what is important and what there is to preserve. So again, we are looking for those places where history and a physical anchor converge. In order to carry out any preservation activities, we need a good idea of what physically exists. Generally speaking, we're looking for resources 50 years old and older. And on top of that, we make an evaluation of historic integrity. Some of the qualities of integrity are tangible. Location, design, setting, materials, and workmanship are all things that you can kind of put your hand on. Feeling and association are more subjective. Our shorthand litmus test for integrity is asking, would someone who was present during a resource's historic period, which we refer to as the period of significance, would they recognize it today? Has it been heavily altered? has the setting changed so much that we now have a building that's orphaned and out of place? Is the roof collapsing, but it's still clearly a Queen Anne? It has all of its details and fretwork and windows and doors. A building can be in poor condition and retain historic integrity. To help illustrate some of the work that we have done at the Alabama Historical Commission, we've got several grant projects we're wrapping up that have really focused on documenting those common and somewhat overlooked resources throughout the state. 3 projects are currently wrapping up that were funded by the National Park Service. We had a Hurricane Michael survey, which covers 3 Wiregrass counties and Dauphin Island, the Montgomery Civil Rights Movement, and documenting Alabama's slave dwellings. We're about halfway through African American education context. And I'm going to talk about each of these to give you some examples of the kinds of resources we're looking at and evaluating. So the National Park Service granted the Alabama Historical Commission funds in 2018 after Hurricane Michael came through to conduct architectural surveys in the affected counties in South Alabama. So the map here illustrates known and listed properties, and you can see we've got some clusters and some pink clusters and some more pink clusters. Those are all survey points based on this survey. You might notice that there aren't a whole lot of other dots on this map. To date, Geneva County has no National Register listings. Henry County has 2. Houston County has 12, and 2 of those are the result of this project. And we also have 4 historic district nominations pending that will be reviewed by our state review board in September. So in this sense, the Wiregrass has really been underrepresented in the documentation of historic resources in Alabama. This image, by the way, is we have an interactive GIS viewer map on our website, and we've got points and polygons for historic districts in the state register, national register, easements, African American schools, historic cemeteries, historic markers. So if you're ever curious about what may be out there, it's a good place to go. And we've scanned the document. So if we've got a document, you can pull that document and access that file from that map. So 2 of the listed properties from this project so far have been the Dupree School, which is in the Ashford vicinity. It's just south of Ashford in Houston County. It was built in 1904 as a 1-room schoolhouse. It later got a 2nd room and then was further expanded in 1937 as part of a PWA project. The school served as an important community meeting place at a rural crossroads. There is nothing at the intersection where this school is located. But it's also an important example of a rural schoolhouse. So it's got architectural significance. The Friends of the Dupree School are working hard to preserve the school and hold several events throughout the year. And I'm sure they would be delighted to see any of you down there. They are very active and very enthusiastic about their school. And they've received funds to start the renovation of this building. The second building is the Bank of Columbia, and it doesn't look like much, but it was established in 1912 as one of the 3 early banks in Columbia, and the only one of those 3 that survived through the 20th century. Because of the 1960s alterations of this building, we had to give it a period of significance from 1964, which is when the date was, when the alterations were made, through 1977, which is when the building ceased to be used as a bank. And while not the reason for its significance, the Anglin brothers robbed this bank in 1958. And their claim to fame was that they escaped from Alcatraz in 1962. The Columbia Historical Society owns and cares for this building, and they also are undertaking renovations. We have 4 proposed historic districts resulting from this grant. Headland, Ashford, Geneva, and Slocum are all unique in their kind of physical composition and arrangement, but they do share a regional history related to their development and significance. They're small agriculturally based communities that relied on the railroad to provide access to resources away from larger towns like Dothan. And these districts will be considered in September by our state review board, and then we'll send them up to the Park Service for final review. And I'm going to tell on myself a little bit. When I first moved to Alabama, I heard all about the Slocum tomato, and I'm reading the district nomination for Slocum. I'm like, they didn't even mention the Slocum tomato. How could they not mention the Slocum tomato? I did my research before I opened my mouth, and I'm glad I did. Not in the historic period yet. So no Slocum tomato in this one. But maybe someday we can update that nomination and get that tomato in there. Another project was documenting the Montgomery Civil Rights Movement. Projects had already been done in Birmingham and Selma. And I think when most people think of the Montgomery Civil Rights Movement, there are certain images that come to mind. Rosa Parks' mugshot, Martin Luther King Jr., his church, Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and Holt Street Baptist Church, which was the site of the first mass meeting in 1955, and aerial images of the Selma to Montgomery March, marchers going to the Capitol in 1965. These iconic images are kind of Montgomery's low-hanging fruit with the civil rights movement. And the goal of this project was really to get a better understanding of the breadth and depth of the movement, to understand those lesser known events, the lesser known individuals, the grassroots efforts that made these well-known events possible. The foundational document that this produced is called the Civil Rights in Montgomery, Alabama, Civil Rights Movement in Montgomery, Alabama, 1850 to 1984. It's a long stretch. And NPDF provides an overarching historic narrative to serve as the context for listing other historic sites in districts. So the context highlights a number of points and counterpoints, kind of action, reaction throughout the movement. And we're gonna see a little bit of that in how the nominations were actually structured. We decided to end the study period in 1984 because that was the year that Leadership Montgomery was created. And Leadership Montgomery was the result of community leaders from the white and Black community coming together saying, we know there are leaders out there, but we don't talk to each other. We need to talk to each other after the Todd Road incident in 1983, which was a conflict with police where some mourners from out of town were attending a funeral and ended up with, it was a violent conflict. So we stretched that up to 1984. Centennial Hill, which is not too far from us, where we are right now, was listed under this document. It's one of Montgomery's earliest African-American neighborhoods. It's immediately north of Alabama State's campus. And the neighborhood had strong ties to the school and a thriving business district. It includes the Dexter Avenue parsonage, which was bombed while Dr. King was pastor to the church, and also home to many of the civil rights movement's activists, Dr. Richard Harris, Georgia Gilmore, Johnny Carr, Rufus Lewis. The neighborhood residents provided a critical support network for the movement on a daily basis, providing rides, food, lodging, and sanctuary. The Benmore Hotel, pictured on the left, was the only hotel that could accommodate Black visitors that were coming to Montgomery. There were a handful of boarding houses that you find in the Green Book, but the Benmore was the only hotel, the only kind of public lodging facility. And several years ago, I had a visit from an elderly gentleman who came in to talk about the Benmore and remembered being young and this being open. It was an open rooftop and listening to live music and dancing under the stars. And that just kind of paints a lovely picture to me. It is a large neighborhood. And I don't know if you can see, I put a little star on there. I can't see it from here. That's where we are. And there's the district. It was physically severed from Alabama State by the construction of I-85. It stretches over to Oak Park, which in itself was a conflict point during desegregation, and is bounded roughly by South Union. Is that right? South Union on the west, and Highland Avenue and High Street on the north, with this little bump up to get the Dexter Avenue parsonage. And I think put another red star up there, or another star. This is going to be our next one to give you some context for where we're going, which is First Baptist Church on North Ripley Street, also known as the Brickaday Church. It was led by Reverend Ralph Abernathy, who served as pastor from 1952 to 1961. Reverend Abernathy was one of the founding members of the Montgomery Improvement Association, which was the organization that initiated the Montgomery bus boycott. In 1961, the church was under siege by the Alabama National Guard after the incident, the attack on the Freedom Riders at the Montgomery Greyhound bus station. There was a mass meeting there that evening, and they were shut in. And kind of as a reaction of local government to some of these civil rights activities in the 50s and 60s, in 1963, the Montgomery Police Department built their headquarters directly across the street from First Baptist, to mark again kind of these series of points and counterpoints, and to mark another turning point then. In 1980, the pastor E. Baxter Morris was appointed as chaplain of the Montgomery Police Department. So we see this kind of back and forth in race relations kind of play out between these, in this location, between a couple of buildings. And he served in that position until his death in 2021. The church is also architecturally significant. It is an excellent example of French Romanesque architecture, and it was designed by African-American architect Walter T. Bailey. Peacock Tract Historic District is in West Montgomery. It's also a historically Black neighborhood. It was home to Edie Nixon, Rosa Parks, Reverend Robert Gratz, Inez Ricks. And again, they lent support and food and raised money to support people, to support the boycott. It's also home to Mount Zion AME Zion Church, which was where the Montgomery Improvement Association was formed, and Holt Street Baptist Church, which was the site of the first mass meeting to kick off the boycott. It also ended up suffering from the construction of I-85 and I-65, far worse than Centennial Hill did. It basically cut the neighborhood into quadrants, and the neighborhood never really recovered from it. For that reason, we've actually made this interchange. When we do a nomination, we have a list of resources, and they're contributing or non-contributing to what we consider the character of the district. This interchange has been called out as an important feature as contributing to the district. So because it did impact that landscape so significantly, as a reaction to activities that were civil rights activities coming out of this neighborhood. And of course, the Selma to Montgomery March passed through here, passing from St. Jude, which would be down here somewhere, up Oak Street, over up Holt Street, and down to the Capitol. Okay, see what I did there? I used this slide earlier to talk about big, important houses. There are at least 270 antebellum houses listed in the National Register in Alabama. And it's really only been in recent years that we've started looking at these as more than just architectural artifacts. What do these resources tell us about an agricultural economy that relied on enslaved people? What do the complexes of buildings tell us about spatial relationships between the enslaver and the enslaved? One of the components of this project was to update a nomination. This is Magnolia Grove in Greensboro. It was written in 1973. 1973 nominations don't have a whole lot of information in them. So it was listed for its significance in architecture and also for its association with Richmond Hobson, who was a Spanish-American war hero. But what we decided to do was to update the nomination and to acknowledge the presence and influence of the enslaved within this complex of buildings. So as part of that process, we are acknowledging the system of slavery that made such a complex possible. One utilizing slave labor to create the buildings. You know, the early nomination says that Isaac Croom built the house. He didn't build that house. The enslaved people built that house. So, and they shaped the landscape and they supported the lifestyle of their enslavers to allow them to live in a complex like this. So thanks to the Historic American Building Survey, this is a 1934 site map that was done as part of that documentation. We have a good site plan to work from, which shows where there were extant buildings, which is helpful because not all of these buildings are still there. And why is this important? The spatial arrangement tells us something about the hierarchy of social relations. You know, at the rear, there's a cluster of buildings that makes up the domestic yard. It was a kitchen and laundry. This is actually a 20th century building that was the site of the bathhouse. This was an office. There was a well. Interestingly, though, the Habs documentation omitted a building from their site plan. It was in a photograph, though, right there. That was the privy. It wasn't nice enough to put it on the map, apparently, but that's where it was. And archaeology tells us that that is the likely location of a pit. So even further from that domestic yard were the slave quarters. There's one extant building today, and this is looking through the window toward the main house. And you get a sense of the distance between the quarters and the enslaver's house. And if you look at that site map, the only thing that shared the distance on the other side of the property was the barn. So that's kind of gives you a sense of what they thought about where they kept their chattel. I mean, let's be honest about it. That's what they were doing. They were pushed out to the edges of the property. So as we update the description of the property, we turned it on its head, and we're starting with this building. We're starting with the back of the house, and we're moving forward. So the last description will be the main house, to try to put the emphasis on the fact that the only reason this property exists is because of the people who lived in these quarters. We've also included the sites of the lost buildings because we know where they are. That contributes to our knowledge of the spatial arrangement and how these domestic yards were set up. But also there's a potential for more archaeological investigation that might yield more historic artifacts. And just quickly, our African American education context, we're only partway through it. It's intended to develop a historic narrative of schools from Reconstruction to 1972, exclusive of the Rosenwald schools. There's already a context for that. And this is important. You know, we've got the Armstrong schools pre-Rosenwald. It's got a lot of integrity. Its condition's terrible. So that kind of illustrates that point where you can have high integrity, poor condition. And up to equalization schools, you know, the schools that were developed to maintain a separate educational system. And this is important because we get a lot of calls from people who want some sort of attachment to Rosenwald. Everybody knows what Rosenwald is. Yeah, I guess in African-American education, that would be the low-hanging fruit. The Rosenwald school, well, you don't have to be a Rosenwald to be important. So that's kind of getting to the fact that there are a lot of things in our environment that may not be that one particular type, but that doesn't mean it's not significant. So just briefly, I want to talk about a couple of things that have been brought to our attention that are not projects of our agency. And Springville Lake Estates in St. Clair County, it's just across the Jefferson County line as you head towards Asheville. These are the fellows who brought the grill out and cooked us hot dogs and hamburgers when we went out there. It was established in 1957 as a summer resort community for African Americans. It was targeting Black professionals from Birmingham. And this was one, when we were getting the information and we really struggled with, they sent us a picture of the postcard, and then they send us this big map. But when you look at the aerials, all you see are trees. It's like, what exactly are they trying to tell us? Which is why we went out and made a site visit. This is located at the end of a valley road. I mean, if you have to want to go there to get there. And I'm sure that had a certain appeal in the late 1950s, where you started to see rising racial tensions in the cities, that something well off the beaten path was going to give African Americans a safe place for recreation. There are over 400 parcels in this development, where the center portion here, that was the lake, and public access points, that's the entrance, and then they had public beach heads here, and that one, there was a boat pier down there. To access it, you had to be a member, and to be a member, you had to be a landowner. So some people bought parcels solely to be members, and that never really built out. The lots didn't develop, but it gave them access to the facility. And these red dots it's hard to tell in the woods. These red dots are about where structures remain today. And they're really nothing to look at. This one's the clubhouse that they use. That's their community meeting place. But most of what remains are very modest concrete block buildings, 1960s mobile homes, remnants of retaining walls. There are brick barbecues, there are well houses. The boat launch remains, but the dam washed out in 1979, so the lake is gone, which is part of the reason we were having trouble envisioning what is going on here. But resources like this give us a glimpse into kind of the recreational aspects of African Americans during a period when we're so focused on the civil rights movement. There's other living going on when this is happening. So this is very interesting. There was a companion white development. It was an out-of-state developer that set both of these up. And the white development with the lake, actually all those lots ended up building out, the vacation homes. So even how they used this location tells us something about the kind of the approach to recreation. Very interesting story. Young Farm in Pike County. This was one that came to my attention through the Century and Heritage Farm that is run through the Department of Agriculture and Industries. The farm was established in 1904. It's got this nice little folk Victorian farmhouse. And it features several barns and had operated a general store. It's an architecturally interesting complex. We don't see a lot of large barns in Alabama, but it's also an important piece of agricultural history in Western Pike County that served as a community meeting place. And I'm very hopeful that Mr. Young will submit his Alabama Register nomination to us soon so we can add that to his list of Century and Heritage Farm designation. And this one's just fun. I don't want to overlook North Alabama. Many years ago, there was a project started in Paint Rock Valley, which stretches from US 72 up to the Tennessee state line between Huntsville and Scottsboro. And the River Valley was known for three things: watercress, moonshine, and the belted Galloway cow, the Oreo cow. I just really wanted to put the cow in there. So that's why I'm talking to you about that today. It's somewhat secluded because of the terrain, and because of that, I mean, almost regularly, except for this little cluster here, the kind of evenly spaced hamlets that developed in that community. So documenting a linear rural landscape is not the easiest thing to do, but if you're ever up that way, it's worth a side trip. It's very, very pretty. Okay, almost done. I'm going to close with a story. This is my house. It's a 1912 bungalow. It's a bungalow in a neighborhood of bungalows. So I think it's fabulous. It's a bungalow in a neighborhood of bungalows. I know that. But it helps form the tapestry of my neighborhood. And if it was taken away, you know, you'd notice it. It would disrupt those visual qualities on my street. But again, to try to illustrate that, you know, we're looking at the convergence of places and stories for preservation. Places connect people, you know, to memories, to each other. And we had the opportunity to get to know the man who was actually born in the house in 1921. He was delivered by the doctor who lived across the street on the corner. He told us about the mean woman who lived next door who didn't like the kids roller skating on the sidewalk. He asked us if we'd found the cedar tree he'd planted as a boy. We finally did, and it was dead thanks to wisteria. When we removed the cementitious asbestos siding from the house, we found where he carved Dan. He carved his name in the wood siding under the window. And his son drove him past the house every Sunday until he died. That was home for him. You know, this is a place he wanted to remember and connect to, and we got to share in that. And the preservation of places that connect us to those memories is important. So this is where I get off my soapbox. I hope that each of you might be encouraged to appreciate the world around you and see how our built environment connects us with our history. There are various programs. We at the AHC are dedicated to documenting these sometimes overlooked places and their histories, the places that fill the gaps between the big and important places and events. So with that, I'd like to say thank you to the Department of Archives and History for asking me to be part of this year's program, and thank you all so much for coming.
What a great way to end with that personal story, the personal about these structures. We do have time for some questions, and I will say that for our audience watching online, you can put those questions in the chat, and they will come to us when we get to those as well. We'll start right here.
I was wondering about two locations nearby. I was wondering if y'all have considered trying to preserve the home of Mose Tolliver who's nationally known folk artist. And when he was alive, many, many people, including myself, went to him and watched him paint, bought his paintings. And I know his work is in many galleries around the country. So he's a significant person in Alabama. And the other one is P. Level in Wetumpka, which was the home of Clifford and Virginia Dewar, who Clifford was very active in Rosa Park case.
They both were.
Right. And so those two, I've been wondering if there have been common places that are going to be possibly preserved.
The tricky part with any of that often boils down to ownership. You know, who has it? What do they want to do with it or not want to do with it? You know, certainly, at least like through our grant programs, we don't grant funds to individuals or private properties. If one of these locations was owned or operated through a foundation or nonprofit or something, that would certainly be something that we could assist with. But we're really not in the position to go out and try to acquire and preserve and do anything. That said, you know, legislators often slip in things to allocations that we receive because they do want something specific to happen. And I wouldn't say it could never happen, but it's not something that would be on our radar right now, certainly, but important places.
Other questions from the audience? Well, I'll ask one if you don't mind. So I was telling Christy before we started that Dupree Schoolhouse is about 3 miles from the place where I grew up. And she is correct. There is literally nothing at that crossroads except for that school. But what has happened there over the last 5 or 6 years, it's been really interesting to watch from afar, and the community that has built up around that school. A few people who actually were attendees there, were students there, but really their descendants and just the people who are in that community. So that's an aspect of it that is really interesting to me, is that these are physical spaces that you're marking. But can you talk a little bit about how you work to engage the communities around these structures?
I mean, I think Dupree is a good example of, you know, I'd say there's a reason that sometimes we're referred to as hysterical preservationists. You know, people especially people where you have a very, very strong connection with a place. People get very passionate about it, and it is multi-generational. Steve Smith has been kind of the driving force for Dupree School, and his mother is like 90. And she'll ride up to Montgomery with him to come to our office. And her hair is done, her makeup, she's a beautiful woman. And she was a student, but it speaks to, there's this multi-generational aspect. And they have bluegrass festivals, and they had Fourth Fest. I think they had maybe 2,000 people come to Fourth Fest this year. And it really has just become kind of a place for them to come together in that rural community that had always been, excuse me, kind of a nexus for them. So a lot of it really has to be generated from within. You know, we can come in and say, your building's wonderful, you should save it. But if nobody cares, then it doesn't do any good. Sorry, I don't want to cough at you. So a lot of it, I think people are, by the time they get to us, they're motivated. The Hurricane Michael projects were a little different because that was money we didn't seek out on someone's behalf. The hurricane brought us that money. But people have certainly been very excited, I think, to see that their communities are being documented and recognized, and that, you know, that kind of brings some personal pride to some of these communities, because as you saw, there weren't a lot of dots on the map down there in the Wiregrass. We just didn't have the documentation in those counties. And this has literally put them on our map.
We have another question.
Is St. Jude part of any historic?
It's its own historic district. The city of St. Jude, it is. It's listed.
I've always been intrigued because I was here in 1965, when the Selma Montgomery March ended at St. Jude. And all of a sudden, I noticed conflict in the community between what Alabama State got out of it and what St. Jude got out of it. And it's always been very confusing. But I know where the march ended.
Yes.
Because I was there.
Yes, the Montgomery Interpretive Center is not on the trail. And I'm going to leave it at that.
We got a question right here, then I'll come to you. Let's do this one first, then I'll come to you.
Centennial Hill here in Montgomery, it is, it's so historic. It has lots and lots of history right there in Centennial Hill. Benmore Hotel. There was a house there that was the first Black senator's house, Alabama senator's house, and it was torn down. Why? I don't know. But do you have any information on what's going on or any interest that may be going on in Centennial Hill?
So the question, and I forgot to do it when Reggie asked his question, was to try to repeat for our online viewers, a question about Centennial Hill. Significant places have been torn down. Do I know what's going on in Centennial Hill? I know the Housing Authority got a planning grant for the Choice Communities neighborhood. I don't know where that is. I know that the Church of the Good Shepherd is working on renovations to put in kind of a visitor center for pilgrims, because of course that was Reverend DuBose had been pastor at that church and was unceremoniously removed from the diocese and told to go somewhere his liberal views might be more welcome. But they're kind of taking that and telling that story. So I know that's going on. The last I had heard, and I don't know if it went through or not, when I worked at the city, there were talks again with the owners of the Benmore about trying to get funds through the Park Service, but previous efforts hadn't worked out. I don't know if that one did or not. So, yeah, but it's a great neighborhood.
It is.
And it's got a lot of history.
Got one more question over here.
I was just not entirely clear on the First Baptist Church Ripley, and then the police department was built across the street.
Mm-hmm.
What was that intended to be, confrontational or
Yes, it
protective,
was, because it had been a park prior to that. And the decision was made to move the police headquarters there. And you've got St. John's AME Church up on Madison. And that used to be a residential area. So that had been a park. And they decided to get rid of the park and plant the police station there. Yes.
Where had the police station been before?
I think the drunk tank is still behind the old council chambers in City Hall. So I think they were still headquartered out of City Hall.
One more question right here in the front.
Just a curiosity, the apartment complex at the top of Court Street, I know it was bought and they were going to renovate it, but is any more work being done there? Do you know what I'm talking about?
The old,
Yes.
I'm drawing a blank, Hilltop Arms. Is that the one?
No, it's the top of Court. Yeah.
Oh, Grove Court?
Yeah.
As far as I know, there are workers there every day. There aren't a whole lot of workers there every day. But they're working on it. And they have also purchased the Winter Building on Dexter for a future project once Grove Court is complete.
I'd love to see it finished.
I would too, because, it,
When I was a social worker, I've been through there. It always had such possibilities. It looked so horrible.
well, it won an architecture award in, 1947? Yeah. It was designed by the architect who designed the house I'm working on right now. So before he did that building.
No shortage of good projects in Montgomery and
Oh, yeah.
everywhere else in the state. So another round of applause for our speaker, Christy Anderson. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you back either tonight for Alabama in the Movies, on the 27th for our genealogy workshop, or on August the 15th for our next Food for Thought. Thanks, everybody. Be well.